A couple of years ago, it was 19 years to be exact. I just graduated from seminary and moved to Memphis. And, I was green, and I had been here about a month, and the church that I was working at the time owned a church building, unlike us, and so there were funerals there often, and you would often get pulled into, as a staff member, serving in a funeral. And I didn't officiate the funeral or anything like that, but I was, my role on this day was to be there during visitation, which was about 3 hours before the service was going to start. And I was just in the fellowship hall. And I just greeted people and welcomed people. And, I will never forget this day because there was such joy in this room. There was such, it's hard to describe. Like, at this point in my life, I had never been to many funerals. So I really did not know what to expect. And I think going in, my expectation was that everybody was going to be sad, everybody was going to be crying, that they were going to be hugging the neck of the widow and her family and kids, and it was just going to be a sorrowful day. And it was just the opposite. It was a celebration. There was joy. There was laughter. They were celebrating a life well lived. And so the service started, and normally we wouldn't step into the service, but I was so drawn to this man. I had never met him, but I had just experienced the people's lives that he had touched. And so I stepped into the auditorium, and every seat was taken. It was standing room only. The balcony was full. And so I literally, they had an organ on the side. I stepped around, and I sat on the floor where the organ was, because I just wanted to experience this man's funeral. And they had an open mic at this funeral. And I hadn't been to a lot of funerals, but it was an open mic. And people began to walk up to the mic and share stories of how this man had loved them, had met them in crisis, had provided a ride, a food, a place to stay, had discipled, had invested his life, had taught them Bible, had prayed over. Like, the stories just went on. And I'll never forget his son just talking about his dad. And at that point, I had no kids, but I thought, the power to have his 60-year-old son sit there and just talk about his dad. And I thought, what a life. A life that was not lived for himself, but a life that lived with eternity in mind. A life that lived from everlasting to everlasting as its focus. 2 weeks later, another funeral. Senior pastor was gone, and so I got called to go visit the family at their house. I still remember this because of just how opposite it was. But I also remember it because the first man that passed away was 81 years old. The second man that passed away was 81 years old. And so I was driving to their house, and I was pulling into this cul-de-sac, and I was anticipating that there were going to be cars everywhere. And I pulled up, and there was nobody except one car in the driveway. And this was 19 years ago, so I had my flip phone and my pager, and I couldn't get on my smartphone and text somebody saying, is this the right address? Am I where I'm, so I just pulled in the driveway and just went up to the door. And the man's son, grown son, 55, 60 years old, answered the door and invited me in, and it was just the two of us. And basically, what unfolded over the next 30 minutes was, I don't have a relationship with my dad. And I'll never forget the quote. He said something like, life for my dad was about my dad. And everybody else just kind of got in the way. And he just shared about just broken relationship after broken relationship, failed marriage after failed marriage. He said, man, my daughters are not even coming back to their grandfather's funeral. He said he had no relationship with them. He said, I'm not going to make them come back. He goes, matter of fact, we don't even really want to do the funeral in the church building. Can we just do it at the graveside? And so a few days later, there was the graveside service. And at that graveside, it was me, the senior pastor, this man's son, and the man's son's wife. And there were 4 of us. And I just remember the comparison of a life that was spent investing in others and those that was spent on himself.